All right, welcome to the second webinar series on nature-society interactions. So this is organized by the GOST group, a subgroup of the Sustainability Transition Research Network, by myself and Camilla Klebna and Christian Binz, and with assistance from Mari Vardeberg and Sofia Olbu. So I'm Markus Stern. I see quite a few familiar faces and quite a few unfamiliar ones, so I think this is great. We had quite a lot of people joining the first webinar a few weeks back, and a lot of people are joining also today, and that's great. And I guess this kind of reflects this increasing attention to this topic of the role of nature and nature-society interactions in transitions and in economic geography. So I will introduce the speakers today, and I will moderate the Q&A. Just very briefly, a little bit of background. So why this webinar series? Well, it's kind of clear to many of us that nature has sort of largely been absent in both economic geography and sustainability transitions research. And also increasingly clear that we need to think more about this, because how the transition unfolds and the conditions for transitions has a lot to do with nature and impacts nature in very different ways. And we'll hear about that today. But we need to think about this more. We need to think about how to integrate nature conceptually in our research, and what we mean by nature. It can be understood in different ways. And what are also the implications then for how we do empirical research, and what kinds of, for instance, interdisciplinary collaboration that we seek to initiate and engage with. And I guess we touched quite a bit on this in the first webinar a couple of weeks ago. And for those of you who are interested, you will find it online on YouTube or on the link on the GOST webpage. So you should be able to find that. If not, just reach out to us and we'll help you. So we've now come to the second webinar, and we'll hear from Rune Njøs and Huiwen Gong. Just wanted to announce also the two last webinars. There will be one in 2 weeks from now, 24th of April, and then the last one on 22nd May. So remember to sign up for those if you're interested. And all webinars are recorded and will be put online for the record. So today's speakers are Rune Njøs and Huiwen Gong. So both are based in Norway. Both are associate professors, and both have, I think, made some very interesting contributions recently to understanding the role of material resources and the tangible, as Rune would put it, in recent research. I think Rune mainly sort of framed this contribution in the recent paper that he will focus on today, mainly like in the context of economic geography, and Huiwen's paper that I think she'll focus on more geared towards sustainability transition research. But I think there are some very interesting they're complementary in a sense. So I really look forward to this. Before we begin, I will very shortly give the floor to Rune. Please remember to stay muted. And Rune and Huiwen will both have about 15 minutes to present, and thereafter we'll have a Q&A session. And for the Q&A, please put your questions in the Q&A and use the like function to give support to questions that you would like to have posed, and we'll try to moderate as good as we can. Okay? So with that, I will stop sharing, and Rune should be able to bring up his slides and yeah, get going. So floor is yours, Rune.
Thank you, Markus. Then I will share my screen, and hopefully it all works, which is the usual disclaimer in these online meetings. So thanks, of course, for the invitation. I think it's a really interesting topic, and it's also really nice to be invited to such a session. And hopefully this could also spark some discussion, etc., afterwards, after mine and Huiwen's presentations, which is also what I've, in a sense, attempted to do in this presentation, right? Because I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that Markus mentioned, but also try to lift up some questions that hopefully are of interest to everyone here, or most of you here, that we can discuss a little bit more later. And Marcus sent me an email just before this webinar that he was not going to introduce us too much, so we were going to do that ourselves. And I'm going to say a few words about who I am, because I think that also makes sense a bit in this context of this presentation. Because my name is Rune Njøs. I'm previously employed at the Moon Center in Bergen, right, where I have my PhD in economic geography from the University of Bergen. And I worked in a way at the intersection between economic geography and innovation systems or innovation studies. And when I was in Bergen, I had a teaching for engineering students on a master's program in innovation and entrepreneurship, which means that as a social scientist, you have to try to communicate with engineers who are coming in with a bit different cognitive frames or mindsets or whatever. So to explain these kind of systemic intricacies to people who are very used to finding the answers, that is quite a challenge, right? So it's also something about communication here. So that is the first reason for this interest towards this kind of topic. And the second interest, I think that emerged a bit stronger to me when I moved back to where I come from, which is not Bergen, but it's the inner parts of the Sognefjord, which is a very rural community, whereas in Norway, all kind of rural communities have their own college campuses and so on. So we actually have a campus here as well. It's a quite dispersely populated area. We have a lot of natural resources, of course, but I'm also located in a department called Civil Engineering and Natural Sciences, which again means that you have to communicate with people with a whole different background, a whole different interest, and trying to figure out then how can we mutually inform each other. So I think that forms some of the backdrop then for my interest towards, okay, how can we try to understand then nature and how we use nature and what kind of restrictions does that actually influence on the contingencies we have in terms of industrial development. So the content then, or what I'm going to talk about for the next 12-13 minutes or so, I'm trying in a sense to pick up a bit on where we left off in the first webinar series, or the first webinar of this series the last time around, which to me mainly was about acknowledging and including nature as such into our analysis or understandings of this geography of sustainability transitions. I think it was a really, really good introduction to this and actually setting the stage and really convincing us that we need to pay more attention to nature in our approaches. But so as a second step, or trying to start off where that session ended, I would also say a few words then about this hyphen or the linkages between nature and society. Because we have nature as something that is there, something that we can use, but we also use this mainly through technologies and through infrastructures. So those are also some tangible restrictions, contingencies, potentials, possibilities for what we can actually do and how that actually influences the innovation system setup, for example. So I'm trying to say a few words about that. So my main point here, I think today, is that to incorporate nature, that also involves incorporating how we actually use nature or misuse nature or appropriate nature, etc., which is a big discussion in and of itself. And I think that could also, if we try to understand these technologies as well, these infrastructures as well, could maybe also help us to actually say something about, is it actually good or is it actually bad? Because in what sense? What is deemed maybe a bad technology can, if we try to understand the technology better, incorporate it better, also give us some nuance towards what is the actual implications of this. And as a secondary output, hopefully, and I know that a lot of people have become interested in this recently, is also that if we involve technology and infrastructures into our analysis, that also increases the complexity, of course, because technologies and infrastructures are also systems in and of themselves, which is also potentially a topic for discussion later. And I think it's also relevant and important to put in some kind of a disclaimer here, because this isn't a new topic necessarily. And we are not the first to actually try to address this, because this keeps popping up in different literatures, in different disciplines, etc., and especially over time. So it's in a sense a bit cyclical, right? So it's also about minding our P's and Q's here. So we're trying to say something about something that is in a sense quite obvious, while at the same time adding something new to what we're already doing. So there are a lot of different contributions, both in economic geography and also other literatures, which of course touch upon this topic that we are discussing here today and in this series. And the challenging question, of course, is also that this ties up to philosophy of science, theory of science, different ontologies, and so on. So there are, of course, long-standing debates around these issues that we try to address here. But at least for this presentation, or my take on, is that, okay, the tangible, which is, of course, quite loosely formulated and, of course, also quite complex and challenging concept to use, in this context, it's mainly used for analytical empirical purposes. So instead of then discussing what is real, what exists, what is physical, and so on, we try to use it as analytical categories in order to understand the empirical setting better. And of course, this ties into what many geographers are actually occupied with or abiding with, which is critical realism, right? And I took this quote from Grilich and Souttarotto's paper, which isn't about nature, but about agency. But it doesn't matter because I think the quote is still kind of illustrative of how we and I approach it and understand it, is that these pre-existing structures, whatever they might be, but they can be both social or natural, but this actually influences what actions are possible for us as a society, and of course also what is possible to do in transition processes. So considering this hyphen then, or the linkage between nature and society, I think that also opens for some questions, right? Because I think we all agree that nature matters. I think we all agree that geography matters, but I think the questions should also be about how does it matter? And how can we understand how that means different things in different geographical settings? And last, I think that some more sensitivity towards this could also help us to actually open the black box of what is green. Because that is a very challenging question, at least in the transition studies literature, because we take for granted in a sense that what is labeled as a green technology is actually a good thing, but is it? So I'm not going to try to answer these three questions, but to give some examples of how at least I and we try to work within these confinements of the very large questions. So the first one then, yes, nature matters, but how? We tried to address some of that in a recent paper where we discussed the role of tangibles or materiality in studies of industrial path development. Industrial path development in itself is, of course, a huge literature and different avenues and so on, but it's also very strongly influenced by evolutionary economic geography and systems of innovation and that kind of intersection between those literatures. And I really like the paper by Su et al. And they discuss these kinds of literatures from a more abstract level. And they say that, okay, innovation here is mainly approached as interactive and processual. That means that we focus on the relations, we focus on the practices, and we focus on the interactions between people in a geographical space. But as Martin and Sunley, for example, state in their quite seminal and quite heavily cited paper, is that there are also some tangible elements to industrial path development. They name infrastructures and also sunk costs, and et cetera. And as I showed in the previous slide with the disclaimer, there are a lot of different contributions in a way saying a little bit of the same. But at least in my reading of it, they are doing it in mainly two different ways. So there are two different categories in a sense of these different calls for materiality. The first one is nature matters, the physical world matters, whereas the second camp, that says more about, okay, technologies and infrastructures matter. But there are fewer attempts at actually trying to link these and foregrounding these towards empirical inquiry. And this is, of course, a very challenging debate to go into because understanding materiality, conceptualizing it, discussing it, etc., that opens for quite many questions and so on. So we've been, in a sense, quite pragmatic here. And Leonardi from organizational studies, they understand the same in an organizational setting. And I think that provides a definition or understanding which is the same as what we're trying to do here, right? Materiality can be considered on a continuum from non-human entities that act on their own towards also physical things performing a socially constructed role, meaning, for example, the technologies that we develop for a given purpose. So our contribution here then is trying to link these things, not by saying that nature is deterministic or that we are positivists, but rather try to add this into the current focus in the literature on actors, networks, and institutions, which is what we call social contingencies. And these material contingencies then, they would both be about the natural materiality, meaning nature, but also about the human-made materialities in terms of the technologies and the infrastructures that we're actually applying on nature in order to perform the role that we as actors, networks, and institutions wish to perform. So we try to link this then to the industrial path development literature and setting by saying that we also need to assess better or go more into detail on what the material contingencies actually mean for these processes. And very shortly, we exemplify it through looking at hydrogen production, which in itself is also very complex. And that is one of the points here. It's a very good example of this, I think, because hydrogen, a lot of people are talking about it, a lot of interest towards it, a lot of initiatives, etc. And again, something that recurs over time and in different phases of the last 50, 60 years or so. But one of the reasons for that might be that, yes, it has a lot of qualities, but at the same time, so you can produce it from very different sources and you can utilize it for very different application purposes, meaning that it's kind of not a silver bullet at least, but it ticks many boxes in many different places and for many different industries. And for this region, Western Norway then, its particular interest is towards green and blue hydrogen. And I think it's important to note here that we are not discussing the production of green hydrogen or blue hydrogen in a facility, but rather the upscaling or the commercialization or industrialization of this towards large-scale volumes, right? So not to go too deeply into it, the point here is that we're in a region with a lot of natural resources, which we have exploited over several years. It's, of course, the petroleum industry, which has provided a lot of income, etc., but it's also in need of restructuring. The other important industries here are the renewable energy industries. We have a lot of hydropower production, for example. So both of these industries are interested in hydrogen because you can produce it either from renewable energy and electrolysis towards green hydrogen production, or in the blue hydrogen production, you use natural gas, which we have a lot of in the North Sea, and then you take it ashore, and then you use carbon capture and storage technology towards actually making this at least somewhat or something like environmentally friendly. So the point is different natural resources, very different technologies and infrastructures involved, which again means that there are different actor constellations involved in actually trying to do this, right? So the point then, and this is in a sense maybe a bit speculative, but at the same time, this carbon capture and storage technology is very important here because they're actually building that now and developing that now in Western Norway. It's the world's first full-scale demonstration project for CCS, which means that you capture CO2, you transport CO2, and then you store CO2. And this infrastructure, that is again an enabler of blue hydrogen production. And what we're trying in a way to speculate a little bit about in the paper is that, okay, this development of these infrastructures, the physical, tangible development of these infrastructures might also actually set the direction going forward around this. Because for green hydrogen, if we're talking at an industrial level, you really need to increase the renewable energy production, and you also need to build new grid networks, which again is like a tangible and very physical, at the moment, obstacle for actually succeeding with this. But of course, like I said, this isn't like deterministic in any way, because you also have a lot of these social aspects coming into play. And one of the major challenges here is, of course, the market, right? So to develop a market, so the end product, it's similar, but the production is quite different. So second question then, which is, yeah, it's also about hydrogen. Then the question is, okay, geography matters, but how? So tying up then to this argument that, okay, we have to look at the breadth of resources within a context, both the material and the immaterial ones. Svein Schøtun and other colleagues at HBL, we are beginning soon a study on trying to understand the potential emergence of hydrogen value chains in the region. Because like I said previously, there is a huge abundance of different configurations and potential setups around the industrialization of hydrogen, ranging from production through distribution and transportation towards application. It can take many different forms. And there are a lot of these foresight analysis or future studies trying to assess what kind of setups will actually emerge here and will become important. But what we try to do in this work, which is only recently started, is to look at these socio-materialities then. What is actually happening in a number of demonstration projects in the region that are actually being built, and trying then to understand better how will this influence if there potentially will be setup of a hydrogen value chain. So again, trying to tie these social strategies towards also the infrastructures that are under development in the given places, and trying to understand, okay, what does this mean going forward? So it's kind of a bottom-up approach as compared to a top-down approach in the many quantitative and foresight-oriented analysis around hydrogen. And then we use demonstration projects as kind of proxies for regional strategies, by saying that, yes, it might not be according to the blueprints of production 10, 15 years ahead, but at the same time, we argue that these will still matter, given that they're actually being built and developed. And as the last example, I'm not sure how much I've left, Marcus, 3-4 minutes.
Well, if you can wrap up in 3 minutes, that would be great.
Yeah, we'll try. Yeah, so the last question then, green is good, we agree on that, but of course it's also more challenging. One of the emerging topics in the literature is, of course, to also consider green in consideration also of other sustainability objectives, like economic development, but also, of course, social sustainability. There are a lot of debates around this, and it's a quite difficult literature to actually get to grasps with, especially if you want to do something a bit more concrete. So what we're doing in this work, Joaquin Hopp and other colleagues, we are using the sustainable circular economy concept because it has as a starting point that circularity, that is something we wish to achieve, but it also actually involves the physical closing of material resource loops or resource flows. So again, trying to incorporate then how can we assess this, and linking this both through looking at the circularity of the concrete initiatives, but also how these initiatives actually perform in terms of social and economic sustainability. And the point then in this concrete work is that there are a lot of theoretical and conceptual discussions around how to approach circularity or how to become green or whatever, but we're trying to break it down into something a bit more applicable by developing some variables that can then be used to inform data collection, data analysis on initiatives within the circular economy. So it's kind of, it's far more applied and far more concrete in a sense, where we try to develop some indicators, and then we use those indicators to assess around 50 circular economy initiatives in Norway in order to understand a little bit better what kind of variables are relevant, but of course also how do these interact. So this isn't necessarily going into the technologies and understanding them per se to consider what is green, but it's again also layering green with all these other considerations based on what sustainability actually is and what we want the world to look like. So we'll soon wrap it up, Marcus, but hopefully, if not takeaways, maybe discussion points for later. As Marcus was saying, I think this might involve a deeper engagement with adjacent fields and disciplines. That isn't uncommon to geographers. We do that all the time, but it's something about actually moving into those debates with people who know the technology and who understand nature and what nature actually is. And I think it involves, again, picking up from last time, that we also need to assess and understand what do the technologies actually mean for our understanding of path development or transitions or whatever in a also physical sense. And hopefully this could also spark some discussions around what is green actually, what is the real effect of these green innovations. Because the hydrogen example, green and blue hydrogen, it's kind of complex if you're moving into trying to understand is this environmentally friendly or not. There are different opinions on this. It means that you have to understand what kind of energy is actually used to run these CCS facilities. And if it's needed to actually develop more renewable energies, like in our region, then there's, of course, it's a question of what kind of technology is needed. Wind power is very contested in Norway because it means that you require a lot of space and a lot of land, which is also, of course, a negative consequence around green technologies. So the point is bringing the technology into frame could also open those questions, and maybe it's not as simple as brown or green, but maybe there is a lot of nuance involved in this as well. But I'll finish very soon, Marcus. Just to summarize, I think we also need to focus on the hyphen. What resources do or can we utilize involving nature, and how do we utilize these resources, textile infrastructures? And again, putting this systemic perspective into this as well, is that, okay, where do these interactions begin and end? And from a systemic understanding, that is always difficult to answer. But at the same time, okay, involving these technologies might mean that the system as well looks a bit different, right? Because it's a bit similar to Vincent Truffer's 2017 paper on global innovation systems, where you, in a sense, follow the tech instead of actually following the networks or the interactions or whatever. So I think I'll leave it there because I think I'm a couple of minutes over time. So yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. And if you think this was a good talk, use the applause button. I'm sure I surely will. So let's move on to Huiwen. But just remember, put your questions if you have them in the Q&A. Use that function. Okay, Huiwen, floor is yours.
Yes, yeah, thank you. I already have everything set up. Sorry, maybe a little bit too quick.
That's
we should
perfect.
give, of course, Rune the applaud. But hello, everyone, and thank you for being here, and also thanks to all the organizers for inviting me. And yes, like just let me maybe share the full presentation mode. Hopefully that you can see the full presentation now. Yes, so about me, I'm an associate professor now in regional studies and innovation here at the business school of University of Stavanger, but I'm an economic geographer by training. And then during my PhD time, I moved to EVAC in Switzerland, where I did more research between like economic geography and sustainability transition, more from an industrial perspective. And I have a interest on this green value chain, especially for the batteries. And so I, for the Marie Curie project I was doing in my PhD postdoc time, I look at the battery value chain in China and in Europe, mainly in Germany. And recently I just started a new project where I look, or we actually, there will be PhD students, we will be looking at the Nordic battery value chain and how, you know, everything is bringing together. We also concerning those kind of raw material concerns. So today's presentation, I will be talking about the role of material resources in accelerating net zero transition. And this is a joint paper together with Alan Anson, who presented also last time in this GOST webinar. And a lot of the details, I will not go through that because it's in the paper and you can read it up. But I will just very briefly go through like how we developed the idea and maybe more importantly, what kind of implications does this have also for the research field of sustainability transition, but maybe also geography, because nowadays we have this kind of geopolitical tensions, and raw material, of course, is a very important issue behind all these kind of discussions. And the starting point of this paper is that a lot of time when we talk about critical raw materials, we had this impression China has the upper hand. They have a lot of resources that they can use. And but is this really the case, especially in green technologies? The argument, if you look at a lot of analysis, it seems like China has really a lot of raw materials that are needed for green transition. But inside China, the discussion is always that we are a mineral poor country, and so here you have different realities actually, and but I want to walk you through this story in the EV battery industry to see how actually China managed to succeed or secure its raw material supply in a very strategic way. So this is more a TEAS paper than a geography paper, but I think it talks really about the core of natural resources, because when we talk about this nature society interaction, as the hosts mentioned many times, nature can be understood very differently, but in this case it's mainly about natural resources. And we know that the transition that is ongoing is very material intensive. So we want to move towards this renewable energy systems, and that is very much different from the fuel intensive energy systems that we see in the current, like the dominant energy system. And that means that we will need a lot more critical raw materials. But if we look at the theory, the role of those resources for transition has not really been well understood, or at least it remains under conceptualized in many mainstream sort of transition frameworks, such as the TEAS framework. So the end of that paper was to conceptualize the material resource dimension of the TEAS value chain. And so we have had two research questions. One is on relates to this kind of material resource flow, and we know that it doesn't always flow like smoothly. So what kind of intersectoral balances is related here, so that you see like some kind of blocks that prevent the smooth flow of material resources. And then the second question is then, how do this kind of imbalances influence the TEAS value chain dynamics, and how do actors react to that? So basically, the basic contour of our analytical framework consists of a few elements. The first part is that we try to differentiate the TEAS value chain into different segments. If we look at the typical TEAS analysis, usually they look at one focal technology, but without really paying a lot of attention to the material side. And here we say, okay, actually, if you want to understand the material imbalances, you actually need to have three segments: upstream, midstream, and downstream. So upstream is more about material provision, and downstream is about material recycling and reuse. And like I said, the midstream part has been the main focus of the TEAS analysis. So we try to also expand this TEAS boundary also to the up and downstream. And the second point is that this TEAS social technical system is embedded in a biophysical environment, which we try to connect to. Maybe this is related to Rune's point about the ending and starting point of the whole system. So I think here we want to emphasize that this system is also embedded in a biophysical environment. And of course, as we learn from the TEAS literature, there are different phases of TEAS development. And in the formative phase, maybe raw material concern is not a big issue, but as the TEAS moves into growth phase, maybe this will become a more important and sometimes even bottleneck factors for upscaling. And this is our visualization of battery TEAS value chain. So like I said, the focal sector in the middle usually is the main focus of TEAS analysis, and then we add these two adjacent sector in the up and midstream. But all this together, they form the focal TEAS value chain, and they are embedded, of course, in the broader biophysical environment. And yes, just have this in mind, and this is how we are gonna basically tease out also the dynamics along this TEAS value chain. But also, one point to mention here is that we have this sector concept. So value chain usually combines many different sectors. So for example, you have the upstream sectors, mining activities, and the midstream sectors. You have, like, for example, battery cell production, and also the battery components production. And then the downstream sector is like recycling and reuse. Yeah, just we try to also separate that they have actually different sector regimes, which we will also come back to in the later part of the presentation. So very brief about the result. So we have this, we identified 3 phases of development. Formative phase, that was like mostly experimentation phase, where you didn't see let's say a big development in the market. But then the second phase, starting around 2015, there was a domestic growth, actually strong growth at that period. And then entering 2020, around the COVID time, we saw a global booming in terms of the EV battery sector. And so then for our analytical part, we try to analyze the material resource in different phases, whether there has been some sort of intersectoral imbalances caused by this kind of material flow, and also how it then influenced the TIS dynamics and actor strategies. I will not go into all the details, but I think this image basically summarize all the findings that we had. So as you see in the first phase, like I said, it was a more formative phase. So material concern wasn't really a big issue at that point of time. So in the Chinese case, you do see like some kind of innovation and also material exploitation activities going on in the upstream, like the mining activities, also processing and refining sectors. There were some activities going on there, but when it comes to the mid and downstream, there was pretty much nothing. And then in entry into this domestic growth phase, you do see some sort of midstream actors. They try to secure material availability through investment into the up and downstream, but it wasn't also a lot, because at that time the market was still relatively small, and through market purchasing, this kind of demand for raw materials could be fulfilled or met. So there wasn't a big issue with regard to material supply. So then you do see that resources were traded through the market mechanism, and there were not more intervention than that. But in the third phase, during the COVID time, at the same time, like COVID time, we have this kind of logistic problems, but at the same time, we do see a booming of the global market. They mentioned that the global market is entering the terawatt era. That means you need a lot of batteries, of course. And here you do see things get more and more denser. You don't not only have, let's say, intra-sectoral innovation activities trying to, let's say, extend or the raw material usage, but also in the midstream, there's a lot of activities going on try to substitute the use of rare raw materials. For example, the sodium-ion battery industry, or not industry, but at least this technology got developed mainly during that period, because concerns on the availability of lithium-ion, or the lithium was the main sort of driving force for this kind of midstream, intra sort of sectoral industrial dynamics. And then recycling, like China had this recycling laws and regulations in place for like maybe 15, 20 years, but in the first 2 phases, they were not really implemented because, there was simply no material scarcity issues. But in the third phase, actually, those laws and regulations, they were implemented much more seriously. And the hope is also that this reverse material flow can work, and then to a certain extent also fill the gap between what the midstream is needed and what the upstream is able to provide. Yeah, so basically then one critical issue is also why this kind of intersectoral imbalances of material resource flow occur, and we argue that it's mainly because of this kind of structural misalignments between different sectors along the value chain. So we have this sector regimes concept, which is defined here as you see a dominant social technical configuration of actors, network, technology, and institutions that outline the positions, roles, and relationships of actors and the problem framings and business culture and modes of innovation. So what those means is that, as you see from this table, the up and mid and downstream sector, they have very different logics, if you will. So they have they are different. They have different sensitivities, for example, to those kind of volatility of the metal market, and then they have different investment characteristics. For example, in the upstream, usually it needs long verification time, and it's also less sensitive to like very constant or instant demand dynamics, because it's a long-term commitment and it requires a lot of resources in order to open the mine. So when it comes to the decision making, usually take much longer. So they cannot immediately react to the demand surge, for example, in the midstream just very quickly. And as you see, they have different project lead times and also very different regulatory environment. So the upstream is strongly regulated and the permitting also takes a lot of time. But the midstream, like the EV battery sector, usually is strongly supported by the government. And so you do see this kind of sector regime difference. They lead to then this kind of imbalances. And what about the coping strategies of actors? We do see that along the whole value chain, there has been a lot of intra-sectoral resource extension effort. So in upstream, you try to expand also where the amount of resources that you can find, but also develop new mining technologies and new type of mines with the hope that you can get more out of the earth. And the midstream, of course, you try to improve the efficiency of the production. And downstream, of course, like I said, in the first two phases, they were not that important, but in the third phase, the expansion in recycling capabilities have been put on the agenda of the whole value chain discussion. And what's also interesting is in the midstream, we see this resource substitution strategy. So like I said, companies increasingly moving also to sodium-ion battery production as alternative for the lithium-ion battery because of the lithium is much more scarce than sodium. And also at that point, the Chinese government also tried to support more hybrid vehicles as an alternative also to this pure electric vehicles, because they also worry that, you know, this kind of raw material scarcity can slow down the whole transition process. And also we see, interestingly, also many different cross-sectoral structural couplings. So you see organizational coupling, which means companies, they try to invest more and move up and downstreams through many different ways, like joint venture, mergers and acquisitions, and also strategic supply agreements just to secure the material supply. And we also institutional couplings, which means that the state try to facilitate material flow by inviting the actors from midstream and downstream to collectively develop some industrial standards, so that what is produced in the midstream can be well recycled in the downstream, so that they can be put back into the midstream production. So this kind of coupling, I think, is quite interesting, like this point I already mentioned. But overall, I think what is really the whole implication for theory and policy, first one is maybe this kind of raw material flow, I think, needs more attention in TIS literature. I mean, we basically extend the scope of first the sector of TIS towards also by including also the up and downstream sectors. And then we see actually this whole idea of circular economy, you know, the downstream being taken seriously into account only happen in the third phase. So this kind of, we think this might be a good sort of like material scarcity can really be an important factor driving this kind of circular economy potential. So, but that also requires more research, because this also has implications on how an industry or how an actor from this industry is organizing the value chain, basically. And we see that the sectoral configuration of a TIS, but also the locus of innovation activities within this sectoral configurations, they also keep changing because of those material flow dynamics. And we also think the dynamics of intersectoral structural coupling is very important or very interesting to further observe if it is also happening in other sectors. And here, for example, the sector regime differences, they create uncertainty for actors, as I shown before. And when the degree of uncertainty is low, we see arm's length kind of trade relationship between different actors along the value chain. Whereas when this kind of uncertainty increases, then you see more like this kind of other forms of structural coupling. And I think when we talk about conventional industrial value chain, the idea often is that when industry move towards more standardized process, then we will have less vertical integration, but more like a vertical specialization. But what we see actually here is that it's the other way around. And we think maybe this kind of material concern has long been taken for granted in those kind of traditional diffusion or like upscaling studies. So maybe if we put or add this material dynamism to the whole analysis, the picture will look very differently. Yeah, I think that's all of my presentation. And thank you very much.
All right, great. Thanks, Huiwen also. So we have a bit more than 10 minutes for questions, and please put them in the Q&A, and let's just get started. And we'll begin with a question from Johan Mjørner to Rune. So Johan has two serious and one less serious question. I think we'll do the serious ones. So Johan wants to know, Rune, what you mean by contingencies in your paper, and how does material differ from technology? And Johan sees strong parallels with the notion of socio-technical reconfiguration in the geography of transition literature. So if you would elaborate a bit on this.
Yeah, I can give it a go at least. And I think the less serious question is probably not the easiest, while at the same time that ties into the first question, right? Because as I tried to say in the presentation, this is a huge and difficult question, and we really don't try to touch upon the latter part of your question, Johan. But at the same time, of course, that influences how you actually approach what is tangible, what is technology, and so on. And to answer the first question, then the contingencies, and again, this is mainly intended as a contribution to the industrial path development literature or economic geography literature, and less towards for example, sustainability transitions. So the understanding of contingencies is in a sense the classical one in EEG or in evolutionary studies, where you can have different trajectories, right, based on the potential that exists within a given context or within a given setting. So it's these potential trajectories then going forward, both in the current moment, but also going forward, and how that influences the observable industrial development processes. So what we try to do then by approaching the tangible or separating, in a sense, technology tangible, even though we don't do that, that isn't the point, but it's trying to assess, okay, these physical things then, how do these physical things then actually influence this? And that, of course, goes back to the less serious question here, because what is a thing? I'm not the one to answer that because it's really challenging. But again, given this background within the literature, and given that for analytical and empirical purposes, I think it's possible to do that, but it's far more difficult if you start going into the more abstract literatures. And again, to me, this also ties into the teaching that I've had previously in interdisciplinary settings, right? Because these kinds of discussions, they're massively important. But at the same time, if you're teaching engineers or teaching natural scientists or talking to them, it's very difficult to say that first you have to have a degree in science and technology studies, and then we can discuss this. So I have to be honest, it's also a way of trying to simplify this somehow. And I know that there are challenges with that, but at the same time, it's an attempt of incorporating just that dimension of, I guess, interdisciplinary work. And how that ties up to the social technical reconfiguration, yes, it does, and it's possible to even go further into that. But as I'm saying, we don't necessarily separate the material or technology. But the point is rather that the understanding then of technology in the literature, at least in my opinion, is leaning more towards the, let's say, social constructivist understandings approach or underpinnings, as compared to the more, let's, for the sake of this context, call it tangible or physical properties. So yeah, sorry for taking almost all the time in stream here, Marcus.
No, that's okay. Let's well, there's a follow-up question from Christian, which I think is a bit related to this. Christian asks how to deal with the fact that we increasingly have to consider two different types of resources that together provide the structural basis for regional and sectoral development. So one type of resource is socio-ecological, and the other is socio-technical. And how could we theorize more consistently their interplay, the conflicts, complementarities, and so forth? And the question is, could following the tech, wherever it leads, help in this venture?
Yeah, is that a question to me or?
That was to you, yeah.
Yeah, because in a sense, I think, again, it's about the object of analysis in a way, like Huiwen is showing here that, okay, if you start with the materials, you end up somewhere. If you start with the technology, you end up somewhere. And I think it's mainly an empirical question, right? Because I think it's so very difficult to conceptualize this or based on theory and then choose the right entry point. But at the same time, I see your point here, because it's like, where does it end or where does it begin? I think that it depends a bit on and this plays into the normative aspects of doing research, right? What are you actually interested in explaining? What are you actually interested in figuring out? So if your starting point is to consider, okay, what are the social implications of this? And then looking, for example, at the materials involved, and then looking at, okay, how this is actually embedded in the work practices or work life or communities in which it's actually developed, et cetera, et cetera. So that is, to me, why these things are also so interconnected, and I think it's really difficult to separate them in advance. It depends, to me, a little bit on what is like the main interest here, and I think Huiwen showed that really well, because there are also so many nuances, right? Looking just in a sense into materials, for example.
Okay, now quite a few questions coming up here. I think I'll follow up with a question now to Huiwen from Alex, asking about sodium-ion batteries and the attention to that occurring at least partly out of concerns around the scarcity of lithium. So now we talked about security issues and geopolitics. Do you see rapid shifts in your assessment of material flows of batteries for EVs?
At this sodium-ion battery is being also upscaling and to a certain extent being mass produced. I would say in China, maybe not at the same level of the lithium-ion battery, but I mean, for also energy storage, it has been like a strong, a lot of discussion going on there to use more sodium-ion battery because of those materials supply issues. But also in the EU, you can see that they are also there are more companies. I mean, mostly startups that are trying to actually use this sodium ion. So I do think that has strong implications on the midstream, like the substitution strategies. But in general, also like when it comes to, for example, cobalt and this cobalt-free batteries has also generated a lot of discussion. That's why you see the coming back of LFP, which doesn't contain any cobalt, and it's also a lot cheaper, of course. And so I do think this kind of availability of resources has a lot of implications on what kind of technology design that is being put out, especially at a large scale.
Okay, so I think I'll allow myself a follow-up question to you, Huiwen, because, and this is from your paper, and there's a thing that struck me a little bit that I was a bit unsure of what you meant, because at some point you say that material scarcities often arise from structural tensions in the TIS value chain rather than the biophysical environment itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to me, this seems a little bit at odds with like how we conventionally understand resources as not kind of manna from heaven that are given, that are kind of necessarily accessible. I mean, some are de facto scarce and they are finite, and they are only resources insofar as they are exploitable. So you do need the investments, you do need the technology, you do need the licensing and the regulation. And I think a lot of your empirical analysis actually demonstrates that. So I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on what you mean there with structural tensions and material scarcity.
That's a question that Alan can answer very well. I think he's there probably. Alan, if you are convenient, maybe you can answer this question yourself, because I think that's also exactly what we received from the review report. And I think Alan did a very good job in answering that. If it's okay, Alan?
I think, oh, I'm not here.
That's
Where's
it.
my camera? I can try, because it's a bit, yeah, what I presented time. So for social science, we're not interested in a sense, the absolute availability or scarcity of resources, but more like how society creates them. Or so, and for many of the problems we were thinking of, looking at in the paper, it was not about an absolute scarcity, right? It was just simply that the incentive structures across mining and the battery chemicals industry were not aligned. So you know, it's not because there was no lithium resources or opportunities to explore them. So that it's so sectoral imbalance is the reason why they were not available for the battery manufacturers. I think that's what we meant, or what Huiwen meant.
Okay. So
Yes.
maybe then it's the statement comes across as a bit more general than you actually meant. This would apply then to resources that are fairly abundant, but not necessarily all resources, right?
Yeah. But
no.
You probably could argue that you know, resource scarcity has not really been a problem. You know, you just find new ways of extracting, or you find something, another material or something, and it's often temporary bottlenecks rather than absolute for socio-technical systems or stuff like that. Even though that's a bit provocative in a times of resource depletion.
Yeah, I think for me, I think it's more depends really on different industries and raw materials we are talking about. And at least for lithium, I don't think there's like an absolute deficit or like a really scarcity there. But there are also, like, for example, cobalt or like other more scarce, like rare earths. Maybe there's this issue that there is like in the absolute term, there's real like scarcity issues. But I think probably we made too general statement there. At this from the battery industry, we do see that this is not an absolute scarcity issue, but more like a structural misalignment problem.
So I don't know how general it is, but I mean, even for the rare earths, it's often a matter of economics, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so this was a lively, great discussion. Thanks a lot again, Rune and Huiwen, for presenting, and for those of you who asked questions, and sorry for the ones that we couldn't take. I think some were maybe better fit for like a bilateral exchange. But anyways, next steps, we have the webinars, as mentioned, upcoming after Easter one, and then towards the end of May. So look out for those, and then many of us will be at the IST in Lisbon and following and participating in the geography of sustainability transition track there. Together with Camilla and Klebna, we are putting together a session at the next GeoInno conference in Budapest early next year. So hopefully there will be a call for papers on that at some point. And for sure, another round of GeoTrack at next year's IST also. So, and also if you're interested in seeing the webinars again or the previous webinar, you'll find them via our website, and we also have a LinkedIn group, and yeah, so check those out and do follow us. And with that, I will say thank you so much and have a nice day and see you later.